4.74 to 5.1 million in 2022. So, this is pretty staggering. And what's interesting now, as I alluded to before about Convene and WeWork and some of these new trending companies, is that now there's new entrants that's accommodating for these workspaces. And now wireless connectivity, reliable and having it reliable, is now an expectation. And with these heightened requirements, the carrier now has the increased difficulty with supporting the demands for these new in-building networks. As enterprise owners become more opportunistic to desire, deploy, and fund DAS networks, it continues to remain a challenge to participate and obtain the carrier coordination. And our panel today is going to discuss the various options and approaches to provide carrier services within the enterprise-funded buildings, and find out new ways of approaching it within the carrier space to bring these systems to fruition within a reasonable time. So let me introduce my outstanding panelists. Ed Myers with Cheytec. Ed brings more than 2 decades of industry experience to his role as Regional Vice President of Sales and Marketing. Ed runs Cheytec's Accelerate program and a distribution channel to bring signal sources to in-building projects. Prior to this, Ed was one of the founders and Vice President of Sales for the telecom group at Parallel Infrastructure, a national build-to-suit tower company. Ed has also held leadership and consulting with the big 3 carriers and fiber tower. Bryan Goldberg, Verizon, Director of Small Cell Real Estate and In-Building. Bryan has over 30 years in the wired and wireless industries. He's been with Verizon for 2 years and is headquartered as the Director for Small Cell and In-Building Network for Real Estate for Verizon. In his present role, he leads the national agreements for strategy, enablement, and carrier. Keith Pennachio, Executive Vice President and Head of Strategy at SQUAN. Keith focuses on corporate strategy and acquisitions, where he works within his leadership team to identify and qualify potential acquisition targets. Keith also handles the company's new client acquisition and service line diversification across all divisions within the SQUAN portfolio. That includes engineering, wireless, and construction. Jodd Readick, who we like to coin as the king of IoT. Jodd has spent over 30 years as a serial entrepreneur, a product innovator, and a management consultant. He's certainly a wild card. He's the co-founder of User-Centric Communications, which was once named by Deloitte as the 6th fastest growing tech firm in New York City. He also started Vumber, which protects personal identity, and he's the co-founder of Unwired Mobile, an SEC licensed wireless operator that develops blockchain technology for mobile roaming. Jodd created the IoT infrastructure for Opti Harvest and is one of the original members of the Angel Investor Group in New York City. So let's give a quick round of applause. So let's start off with Bryan. What motivates a building owner's participation in a wireless network build?
I think the real estate business is pretty straightforward. It's about occupancy and rate. And what they need to figure out is how do they maintain those things. So what we've seen in terms of motivation is this a motivator or a threat? And what we've seen certainly is right now that they need to find a way to solve their connectivity, because it's now become, I think as you described earlier, by Zayo, this is now becoming an expectation as opposed to something that's an upgrade.
Keith, what are your thoughts?
No, we see it a lot the same way, including, as we're going through the whole site acquisition process, where certain building owners are actually making it a part of the lease for some of the tenants, right? And what we're trying to get to the bottom of with a lot of these discussions is, as Bryan pointed out, what is the motivator and actually who's going to foot the bill for the installation.
Jodd, what's your take on this from an IoT perspective?
Well, IoT is one driver. Not all use cases are going to be IoT within a building, but we see a big issue of how do you map user expectations against what the actual build-out is going to be. So depending on who is in that building, what are they doing with the technology, that drives to a large degree what's going to be necessary and how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, we take a financial view. So it's a net operating income potential is really the way, what is motivating the building owners today for us. It's a, kind of a 5-line discussion that we have, which is what's the potential income for the building? What's the vacancy rate, to your point? And then that's, the net potential income minus operating expenses is net operating income. It's not a technology conversation, right? So if we can bump up that net operating income or decrease their vacancy rate because of something that we can do, and they can throw that new income into their cap rate. I know this is a terrible conversation to be having with a bunch of people that are into technology, but that's the conversation to have. That's what motivates building owners, is they can increase the cap rate and increase the value of their investment. If it's technology, if it's low flow water spigots, it doesn't really make that big a difference to them. So that's the conversation that we've kind of pivoted towards, and that's the one that resonates with them, I think, the most.
So one of the things we've certainly seen that is they're also trying to do is they're trying to be forward-thinking and appeal on a green standpoint and a LEED standpoint. And one of the biggest nightmares, I think most people in this room know, is that a LEED certified building could also be making a Faraday cage. And solving for that creates a whole new set of opportunities and challenges.
I add one other interesting point too, from the building investment perspective, is ROI. So if you've got one technology plan that has a certain cost to it and another one that might be 3x that cost, does that additional cost make sense? How is your return? How much risk do you want to take? Because as these technologies become more complicated, you have to think about upgrade plans, and if you're putting a ton of money into stuff, you have to be thinking about spending.
Okay, so let's dial this in a little bit. So from a wireless perspective, a wireless connectivity perspective in the enterprise space, is this more about the conversation about technology or ROI? Ed, why don't you start?
Right, so obviously, we think it's about ROI, and I think that's the motivating factor. Eventually, you do have to have a technology conversation, but our technology conversation isn't really necessarily based around which distributed antenna system is going to go into the building. It's more around which carriers can you attract to come into the building. If it doesn't seem to be an attractive building from a carrier business case standpoint, is there a way that we can facilitate a signal source to come in there and get the carrier in regardless? So is there a way to kind of, for lack of a better term, buy your way to the front of the line and let Verizon come in or one of the other carriers come in when it wouldn't meet their internal business case?
Jodd, go ahead, Keith.
No, I was going to say is, I think originally in some of these conversations, the cool factor with the technology plays a pretty significant role. But once you get beyond the technology piece and tie it to the return on investment is really what's critical and what resonates with all building owners and property management firms. Those who are able to articulate that in such a way that conveys that return on investment is something that will transcend the technology. Technology becomes just a delivery function.
Right, the technology is a means to an end, but I always like, well, what's the end? Right? If you don't understand what it is that you're trying to do, you might have the same number of square feet, the same number of tenants, but what those building requirements are for those particular tenants drives a lot of the cost, or could, depending if they needed additional features that are beyond the simple base case.
I think it's really about pain points for both the tenant and the building owners. There's a custody of pain that needs to get solved. And we see it now more and more in real estate brochures where they're boasting about their connectivity and what they have. So they clearly identified this as something of value that they want to address and consider a feature that is worth paying.
So, go ahead.
One thing I'll add to that, even beyond the building owners using it in a brochure, I don't know if there's anybody from Wired Score in here, but what we've seen is this third-party emergence of willingness to badge a property for a certain amount of technology in the building to support the telecom infrastructure. So, as we start to look at different opportunities or drivers for how this technology merges and gets more attention, groups like that, I think, bring that type of attention, but certainly companies that we all work for participate in making that reality.
Okay, so it is all about money, right? It's all about money. But, we talk about connectivity and whether it's gonna be considered a utility service like water or electric, or whether it should be absorbed by the owner itself. And then, should they set something up differently, and should it be passed on to, the tenants eventually? Jodd, why don't you start off with that?
Well, as from the tenant's perspective, I like to see, is there reliable service? And if there's reliable service, is it fast enough? Is it good enough? Does it have the security features? Does it have what I need? And how comfortable am I gonna be that it's gonna feel reliable all the time? And so if I have a reliable service, I feel a little bit better about paying for it. And, but as time evolves, it kind of goes from, electricity and water to just something that you have to have. So certainly some landlords will compete on a variety of features. You don't necessarily know today that that's going to be built in everywhere, but it's certainly going to be that way over time. It's just a requirement. I mean, imagine if we didn't have Wi-Fi in this place, you wouldn't use it as a conference facility.
So I would say that to delineate on the question a little bit, and this is a little bit of a tired metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's the difference between the water and the pipes. That we think that the pipes is something that belongs to the building, and that infrastructure is filled with that.
Should it be rusty pipes, or?
I think that.
How thick?
And certainly what we want to do, we've got partners that will help building owners get to where we need to be. We certainly are, as a company, Verizon is committed to making sure we're at the leading edge, whether it's 3G, 4G, and of course 5G. And so we want to guide them on a path that gets them there. Certainly there will be upgrades along the way, but we look at those pipes as hygiene in the sense that it's something that's measured in its absence. So in other words, these concept of hygiene versus motivator is the idea that things that are measured in their absence are hygiene, and we believe that broadband and connectivity and this kind of infrastructure is like plumbing, a hygiene function.
We think that AT&T and T-Mobile should pay for it all, right? I think that's really what we're going to. No, I think
It's rent.
It's rent. That's rent. No, I think let's not sugarcoat it too much. The building owner may front the capital, but the tenants pay for it, right? I mean, ultimately, whether it's through higher rates on a per square foot basis when the building gets restacked or the leases come up, or a common area maintenance charge, a camp charge, that gets passed on to the tenants eventually. There's no way that the building owner is actually paying for it other than on the capital side of things. It's just a plain fact that as much as Bryan and Verizon want to cover every 200,000 square foot office building in suburban office parks, they don't have the capital to do it or the time to do it. So it's become kind of our industry's responsibility to cover that, educate the building owner on the finances associated with it, and sell them on the fact that you're in a small building, you want to decrease your vacancy rate, let's standardize on some brands here and get Verizon into every single one of your office parks, right? And Bryan's not going to be able to pay for that. The other carriers aren't going to be able to pay for that, but that doesn't make the demand go away.
Right.
So ultimately, it is getting forced down to the building owner or to the enterprise level.
And that conversation is complicated, right? Because beyond Verizon, as we're joking around about T-Mobile, Sprint, and AT&T, the conversations that we get into, in particular as SQUAN, because we're really neutral in the equation. We work for anybody who is looking to fund a project, pretty much, as long as they meet certain criteria. But what we find is that in that neutral position, a lot of times we're able to convey the story in a very neutral sense to the property owners or to the property management firms. And I think as time evolves, what we'll continue to see is that there will be different parties throughout that cycle of uptake for these networks that you'll get greater participation from multiple entities. And it includes companies like NEDAS, Verizon obviously, and the OEMs as well, and some of the fiber players.
I had one other kind of psychological component. As a tenant, do I want to see this charged separately, where I can kind of understand it and negotiate and play with it? Or do I want to see this built into the lease on a square foot basis or thing? So if I see it as a separate line item, I'm going to be interested in, well, what are the SLAs, what are all of the kind of, not technical things, but how does this technology impact my life as a tenant? So, and are carriers, actually fungible? Is AT&T the same as Verizon? What Verizon features are going to be interesting to me, and I'm willing to pay more or less for them? And so network reliability, multi-carrier are all things that as a sophisticated tenant I want to know about, because it might actually make a difference between which building I go into.
Right, more or less.
Yes.
But if you're looking at it as well, one of the challenges is who's setting that expectation. So is the expectation set by those that are going to be moving in to the building? Is it the building owner itself that's setting the precedent to be able to create differentiation and show a competitive advantage over the competition? Or how is that what's that going to look like?
Well, I would start with who is the tenant. So if you've got here we are kind of in the old garment center area, the technologies for garment center enterprises may be very different than if you are running a VR firm that needs sub-millisecond response. So the sophistication and the needs of the tenant should drive it. If they're interested in that technology because it's core to their business, it's very different than if it's simply a useful function.
I would just say that by the time the tenant shows up, it's too late. I mean, you're negotiating a lease, unless you're taking on the whole building, it's just a lease, it's too late. So a lot of what needs to happen is really proactive with the building. And a lot of the space that's going on that as companies deal with, which is to act as the intermediary, say to the building owner, Verizon's going to be in this building if you're willing to fund it. And there's that need to know, they need to know, these are not trivial expenses, even for a large REIT. And they need to know that we're going to join, we're going to bring a signal, we're going to light that up. And so there's a need for that safety for the building owner, and I think that's an important role that's been performed.
Forward future thinking. And you bring up a great point on that as well, is the fact that it's almost building upon the future that the tenant doesn't even know what they need until they already have it.
Right, so I don't know if everybody knows what our company does, but we can provide the exact same signal source that Bryan would provide if he was going into a building. So that's Nokia gear, Ericsson gear. We have agreements nationally with Verizon and with a few of the other wireless operators to bring signal in when it's owner-funded DAS plus the actual signal source baseband gear, right? So the expectation is that the value that we're bringing is Bryan. We're bringing Verizon. It doesn't matter what the gear is, because what we're doing is providing Verizon the like ownership operation of that gear, and then they can upgrade it. They can continue to support the end users the way that they want to be supported in that particular venue and in compliance with the building owner requirements. So in that case, I think that the tenants, will drive some of the technology requirements as much as they ever drive as end users to the wireless operators.
So Ed, let's talk about this a little bit. So you create a company, a brand new company that focuses on the need, fulfilling a need to be able to help with the funding and bridging the gap. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what types of funding models are out there besides yours, but what else is out in the space?
Right, so we've seen a bunch, and I think there's a couple of folks in the audience today that have kind of started to provide some platforms to that effect. So we've seen a couple of different models out there where there's capital expense associated with the DAS and with the signal source component. And ours is a license agreement, right? It's a 5-year license, and then at year 6, it gets kind of recapitalized. In the case of, there's a company called Macquarie, I think the Macquarie guys are here. They've created a platform that allows, they come in, capitalize the DAS. We can actually include our signal source gear as part of that capitalization as well, and fund it back. And then there's a monthly recurring charge back to the building owner if it's not capitalized as part of an overall purchase. We've actually started to see some of the building management companies, the CBREs, the Jones Lang LaSalle's, those guys are getting into the funding piece as well, because it's a way for them to stay sticky with their management services and help to kind of decrease the overall operating expense of a building. So they stay in on the professional services side as well. So even on the building management side, there seems to be some money available to capitalize these things and then kind of dole it back to the building owner as a monthly recurring.
Bryan, what are you seeing out there in the space? What seems to be trending and what seems to be working well?
I think this model is still nascent, but we like where it's headed. Again, our need is to take on more in building as we build out, but we also know that we can bring signals to almost anything that's interesting that people are getting lit up. We need the help along the way. So whether it's a leased model or it's an outright capital funded model, that's really up to the economics of the building. And we lean back on that as long as it's sitting on the other side of the fence.
Sure. Keith?
Yeah, so we see a mix, right? And, you know, I think for companies like SQUAN, where we're a design build firm, you know, the more tools we have in the tool bag to offer to our client on the network operator side, in presenting to building owners or property management firms, it's about creating channels, right? And where we stand in the ecosystem is how do we generate more workflow for our crews and for our design teams? So for us, you know, as we look at these opportunities and we work with companies like Verizon, with Bryan and his team on certain projects, you know, we take that information and we marry that up with initiatives that, you know, as company Cheytec are involved in on a daily basis, and we use those in our discussion. And it really comes down to educating those who are looking to build these systems at the end of the day. And the more information you have and the better armed you are for these conversations are really what cross that threshold into somebody purchasing or deciding that they're going to spend money.
Jodd?
From the tenant's perspective, I just don't want to pay. Right? I know I'm paying, but I just don't want to see it in a way that is going to impact me. But my needs are pretty simple. I'm not going to change I'm not likely to change which building because it's a few cents per square foot cheaper because of the technology, but I am likely to change which building because the technology works better for my use case. And I also want to get a feeling of comfort that the landlord actually is invested in this process, that it's not just, I don't care, I don't know, who do I call when it breaks? So I want to have a feeling that my landlord is a partner in making this stuff work reliably. So that kind of transcends the economics.
Okay, so Jodd, while we're talking about this, how should new technology updates, how should they cycle? How should new infrastructure be managed? How should it be managed with the building owner, and how that relationship might look like?
Well, it's a complex ecosystem. In some senses, it starts with the carrier because you've got to get the basic raw signal in there, and you have to look at who is paying for each, massive evolution. So as you go from 3G to 4G to 5G, there are these, near $1 trillion industry costs that have to be absorbed by somebody. And in a sense, it's ultimately the tenant that's going to pay for this stuff. So how far in advance do you want to go to have the possibility of features 3 or 4 years from now? So if I'm in a building where I'm going to be doing drone design, I care very much about the technology, and I'm willing to pay dearly to have that feature. But if it's just a basic thing that I'm using to run my business on a day-to-day basis, I don't care about the technology. So it depends on where in that spectrum I sit in terms of what my needs are. Bryan.
So from our standpoint, we certainly have made a point of Verizon to be very forward-thinking and pushing each generation out quickly with things that are pre-standard just to get things going. What's interesting right now with the move more towards an SDN world is that we see that some of the big trillion-dollar forklifts are going to start to wane a little bit, that we'll be in a position where we can do more upgrades without having to do quite that level. I don't pretend to say that we've got it all figured out, but that roadmap seems pretty well spelled out how it's going to work over time. And we think that the right investment in infrastructure, and it's a very fiber-rich approach, will lead towards a more future-proof building, and that's certainly the direction we're encouraging our partners to go in.
Thanks.
We're just glad that carriers are allowing us to buy their basebands for them now. That's a step forward as far as we're concerned from an industry standpoint. But I think, back to the financing piece, there are different platforms available where they actually build upgrades and upgrade costs and upgrade timing into the overall capital package. So depending on kind of where they think, I was actually thinking about Jack Waters' slide about the 30-year bandwidth consumption piece. You don't really know what those upgrades are going to cost, but they're at least kind of putting some provisions in the capital budget for some of the financing packages and the different platforms to try and address that up front.
Agreed. Keith?
Yeah, and there are plenty of gaps out there too. I mean, there are systems that have been deployed over the last 10, 15 years that have gone underserved from a maintenance and upgrade perspective. So, where we find ourselves in the ecosystem, there are a lot of conversations that occur with our traditional projects where those gaps are bridged through our interaction with those building owners. So we'll find ourselves in a position where somebody will say, okay, well, I have this singular DAS in a hospital that really nobody's maintained over the last 3 to 5 years, and by the time you connect the dots, it could be another year, and all of a sudden somebody's taking interest, and then you have third parties that are coming in saying, well, listen, if they're not ready to upgrade or come in and maintain it the way they had originally committed, how can you help us get there? And that's where we serve as that interface in a lot of cases. So again, as a neutral party in the equation, we have the unique ability to have these conversations across multiple lines and bring parties into the discussion. But our goal is always to go to the point of origin and try to recreate what was originally committed to.
And I want to add one other point too. In this environment, people are starting to become actually aware of security as a real issue. It used to be, it was very far away in the back recesses of your mind, but when you think about the data leaks and all of the implications when security goes bad and privacy violations, people are starting to be willing to pay for robust security. I was dealing with a client some time ago, and he said, well, who's running your telecom system? Well, it's the facilities guy. Well, where's he? Well, he's in the basement, looking around the elevators, right? So he had absolutely no who are you going to call if there's a security problem? I guess 911, right? So the level of sophistication, but this was an insurance company, and they didn't even really fully understand their risks of what happens when they get breached. So the idea that the carriers and NEDAS and all of the wireless infrastructure is actually a very vulnerable point in the building is something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so got a final question here to go around the group. We'll start off with Keith. And there isn't necessarily a right answer, but there might be perhaps maybe a best practice. How would you ensure multi-single source participation?
So again, using where we sit in the ecosystem, we work with all the major network operators, right? We work with a lot of the MSOs and ISPs. So from our perspective, it's aligning ourselves with each one of those network operators to try to create a bridge for those parties to join. Now, we see certain applications that demand that more than others. Hospitals, by example, Children's Hospital in Atlanta is very insistent upon having multiple signal sources in the building for obvious reasons, and they'll tell you that this is less about technology and more about having access to the network when their child is in surgery or a family member's in surgery or a friend. So it's really creating that story and that connection and trying to leverage those relationships to bring those parties in. And that's again where it's important to socialize some of these projects with the other network operators and look for that participation. So when Ed is talking to his folks, he obviously has a unique position in the marketplace, but my conversations will transcend where projects that Cheytec may not be involved in talking with Bryan and saying, hey, listen, we have this opportunity over here. how do we get you involved, right? And that's really where it comes in. We're that bridge, and it's socializing the issue and trying to build a coalition.
So my question is, who's screaming for it? If people want multiple carriers, there'll be multiple carriers. If no one's really asking for it at a high enough level and saying this is really important for me, then people are going to do the cheapest thing that they can possibly get away with. So it's a question of, where is the demand?
Well, first off, I can only speak for what we're going to do. So just start with that. But that said, I also have responsibility within Verizon for our inbound neutral host business. So that piece of it is ours. We try to reduce barriers. And our landlords, we have direct relationships with, all want multiple carriers. And we can do certainly reduce friction to make that happen, but guaranteeing that happens, we're insured. If somebody says they can insure, they can get all the carriers. They either have those commitments day one, or there's a little bit of hope.
Right. So we're really hopeful most of the time. No, I think no, it's a good point. I think to kind of build on what Keith said, I just tell a little bit of the story. So I do like triathlons and trail running and stuff like that. And there was one time I was doing this trail race. I don't know if anybody's ever done this before. You get these water bottles that fit over your hands, right? Because in the woods you can't. There's not always rest stops. So I'm running, it's like mile 15, and I'm running down a hill, completely by myself, even though it seems like there's 5,000 people in this race. And running down a hill, and I fell, right? And then literally 5 steps later, I fell again. And this time I fell on my hands and squirted the water bottle in my face as I fell on my hands. And I stood in the middle of the woods, and I just yelled, "Get it together!" I just had to kind of pull it together. And I think that's what you're talking about, which is the only way all of this works, to have multiple carriers. Obviously, we've got a program that kind of kickstarts it and gets some gear and gets some commitment a little faster. But the only way to do it is to socialize it in the market, get the right design, get the right signal source, hit on the right RF guy in market that tells you, yeah, we don't really do untrusted backhaul in this market. We're going to have to order it directly from our network group and set the expectation correctly within the customer organization. So you really do have to kind of weave your way through the organization and kind of get it together. Luckily, Verizon in particular is now coming from kind of a top-down approach to say, look, we want to cover as many buildings as we can, work with these guys and ensure that they're getting what they need from a design, support, and contractual perspective, which has been great.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to open this up. If there's any questions from the audience.
I think it's Mr. Goldberg who said this. You were saying.
Hang on a second.
Oh.
Very good.
All right. Thank you very much. I think you said something along the lines of you're looking for a fiber-rich approach inside buildings, and I was wondering if you could speak to, does that include new build-outs? Is that legacy buildings? Does it impact the models and the finances and what you might choose to do depending on the age of the building? Is it easy to run fiber through, say, an older building? And how would you approach that problem?
Sounds like 5 questions.
It is, and I can add a 6, but I'll hold on.
I think the short answer is any building to be competitive is going to need more of this over time. Certainly, if I was planning a greenfield, I would be heading down that path. From a standpoint of migration, it's really a function of timing and where they're starting. So what were the other 4 questions?
I don't know, but I like your socks. So.
Oh, thank you.
We all have actually pretty cool socks.
Yes, Ernie.
Yeah, it's maybe for Ed. And I think our biggest challenge as a DAS integrator is trying to get RF sources. Right, we struggle with that. Could you be our one-stop shopping for that? Something for T-Mobile?
Sure, you're T-Mobile? No way. Yeah, of course. Yeah, please come and talk to us about it. It's a nice program, and the way that it works is we kind of package everything together. That there's RF source, the carrier licensing, the DAS access, maintenance, and going forward. So and even because we've made these mistakes before, when we tell the carrier that, hey, you know what, someone else is paying for your signal source, we now look at capital costs associated with integration, including that, and even cell site routers. Sometimes we've wound up on site, DAS finished, signal ready to go in, everything's all green lighted, and people are like, oh, there's no cell site router here, we can't really connect it to anything. So, and that's because, it was like, oh, signal source is coming, great, but maybe there's still a DC power plant that, it's not part of what we do. So it's really a communication issue, but yeah, of course, we can certainly T-Mobile, yeah, we'll talk about it.
This was not a setup. Not a setup.
Hi, I'm Gabe Adams with Artest. I got a question for you in regards to BYOD. We got a lot of enterprise out there that are looking to, they're maybe even willing to invest in some of the infrastructure. Maybe they want the carriers to meet them halfway. Some of the carriers have rolled out a BYOD, bring your own DAS program. You can register, do all of that. I was curious on the Verizon side, maybe from Cheytec or all of you, where do you see that going? How do you help?
Well, actually, I'd like to just comment really quick about the BYOD, because one of the things that I think we were talking about before is it's changed the workforce. Because the workforce before, you were coming into an office, now they've got this open space, and now the expectation, you can work anywhere, BYOD, but guess what? You're working 24/7. And now the expectation is we should be able to talk to you at any point in time. So I think that's just a little piece that I think that it's definitely a trend that's changed quite a bit, but gentlemen, go right ahead.
Well, I think BYOD device as opposed to bringing your own DAS.
Bring your own DAS,
Yeah.
I was talking about.
Okay,
Yeah, two different things.
Okay, so two different BYODs,
Yeah.
bring your own DAS.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bring your own DAS, yes.
Okay, good, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Go ahead, Ryan, you guys.
No, I think that we're very interested in that. We haven't productized it quite the way you described, but I think we're partners. So part of the challenge is really the dance across multiple carriers. And from the standpoint of, if I start calling my competitors to knock on other doors, lawyers get very interested in that. And so we're very eager to not do that directly.
I tell my consulting clients, BYOD is kind of like BYOB. Be very careful what's in that bottle because it requires a lot of integration, a lot of thought. You think, well, I'm gonna save money, I've got all this stuff figured out. But if you don't really have the entire project plan thought through carefully, you can be bringing disaster along with your DAS.
Bring your own disaster.
Well, everybody's heard the story of the $1.6 million DAS. It's great, it runs fantastic, but there's no carriers on it, right? Because the BYOD they've done that, they've invested the capital, but they were unable to attract the carrier, unable to do it in a timely way. So, you get 60% of the battle done with the DAS piece. And then, of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be a DAS in the carrier world, right? There's lots of different configurations with indoor small cell and kind of different types of neutral host styles that you can put in. And sometimes they're more beneficial to the carrier. Say Verizon's got a huge enterprise corporate customer and they're willing to put in an indoor small cell system, some type of neutral host DRAN or something like that. So you got to explore a lot of different options. Even though we all love neutral host because it can get most carriers, it's not always the best option depending on the customer or the enterprise.
Yes, Tom Hopkins, Colchester Capital, we're a private equity capital provider. Do you guys work with property owners at all to figure out strategies to monetize in-building access, such as, for example, online advertising strategies, maybe generate on the revenue side or any common charges to carriers to get better access within the building, things like that?
I've got a good question.
Yeah, we don't really cross over into that. I mean, part of that discussion, when it does come up, we steer them towards partners of ours that may have a focus on that. But we don't come across it all that much.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example just up the street. We are finishing up a DAS at the new Marriott Edition Hotel in Times Square, right? That's a 500,000 square foot hotel, the ceiling in the lounge costs more than the desk did, right? It doesn't, but there's also a couple of tenants in that building. There's a big retail space, there's the NFL experiences in that space, Cirque du Soleil, guys like that. So they did not want us to go into those spaces in terms of providing service, carrier service, because it could breach a lease somewhere along the line. It could become, responsible for a piece of technology that wasn't initially part of their lease agreement with the NFL. So they'd say, you know what, I'd rather collect the $50 million in rent from the NFL than, monkey around with that. So, but what we can do in those particular cases is work with the building owner to eventually move into that space, provide some service, and if there is a way for them to pick off a piece of that revenue, they certainly will. And then in the hospitality space in general, we've looked at different monetization strategies where, let's say there's a Starbucks or something like that in there, and they can charge an extra couple $100 because now there's great Verizon LTE service, in there. Or there's a common conference room that they rent out on a per day basis in a, suburban office park market. They can charge another couple of bucks for that. And then that just kind of goes into our ROI argument, right, about additional monetization strategies.
We have two more questions.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. Did you want to, we have one more question. Sorry.
One more question.
Hi, hiding behind the pole. How are you? John Fuller, Safer Buildings Coalition.
It's like we're at a Cubs game. You're like at a Cubs game. I can't see. There you go. Who is this again? I'm sorry.
I'm John Fuller with the Safer Buildings Coalition. Thanks, Steve. The question is one about scale. So there's over 6 million commercial office buildings in the United States. The number goes up 5% a year. And yes, it's true, some of them don't need coverage, but most of them don't have it. If someone waved a magic wand tomorrow and said, here's a check to pay for 1% of the 60,000 buildings, I don't think the industry has the scale to solve for it. I don't know if we have processes, sources, boxes, tax. What does this industry have to do to address that? How do we collaborate to scale to get to 5% or 10% or 20% or whatever it takes? It's a big challenge.
Blank stares up here.
Yeah, I think what we're describing is really a partnership. It's a partnership on the infrastructure side from Verizon, sometimes it's a partnership on the carrier side, and certainly from a property owner standpoint. It's really the need to get lean, and part of what days like today are, is getting that message out of what we think the path is and what the roadmap is to these partnerships. And it'll require a lot of leaning in from a variety of sources. Part of the reason I'm here is to indicate that we at Verizon are leaning in.
So, Brian's here, he's real estate for Verizon, right? I mean, that's his main job. And so cooperation obviously from the carriers. The other thing I think we can look at is the existing assets today and how they could possibly be repurposed. Jack Waters was here this morning. Folks listened to the keynote. I don't know if you know, Zayo's got 34,000 buildings on net today, something like that, with fiber in them. That's front haul, that's back haul, that's being able to do some hubbing associated with reaching additional buildings. There's some assets that are in the ground today that are eminently usable if we're a little bit more creative about the way that they get utilized. And then folks like Verizon are starting to see that and say, from an operating standpoint, I can let somebody else buy my baseband. I can do kind of a virtualized system here and not lose the control that I'm used to. So I think that there's some scale to that by actually leveraging some of the assets that are in the ground today, as well as some of the standards that exist within carriers.
I'd say too, there's a very large interoperability problem, because every time you hand off a process or technology or physical project between one company and another company, things tend to often go slower than you think they should. So understanding in more detail what's necessary, what's broken, and how do you improve that so the next time something happens, it doesn't look like an individual case-based project that's never been seen before. So spending some time to learn from what happened before and that.
Yeah, and I think the forums like this help bring that to the forefront, right? I think, these discussions and, whether they're here or next week at Mobile World Congress, I think these forums serve as an arena to get these ideas on the table, to try to sort through this. And I think, as people get to know one another and what they do and what role they play in the ecosystem, ultimately, that's where you start to build a network of people that are ultimately gonna facilitate these builds.
Excellent, excellent. I'd like to thank the audience for the great questions, appreciate that. Would like to thank our panelists. Thank you very much. Feel free to stop over afterwards and we can continue the conversation. So, thank you.